The call came at 4:47 in the morning, and Nessa knew before she answered it that everything was about to go wrong. She'd been awake anyway. She was always awake at that hour, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she could barely afford, going over the numbers for Aldgate and Sons accounting, like they might suddenly rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They never did, but she kept looking, because looking at numbers was the only thing in her life she could actually control. The call was from her mother. "The firm is gone," her mother said, without preamble, without hello. "Your father signed everything over. To settle the debt." Nessa set down her pen. Outside the window, Chicago was still dark, the kind of dark that felt personal. What debt? The Harrow debt. She knew that name. Everybody in certain circles knew that name. You didn't say it out loud in polite company, the way you didn't say certain other things out loud. The Harrow family wasn't a family so much as it was a system, a web of interests and obligations and quiet understandings that stretched from the financial district down to the waterfront and back again. They weren't the mob, technically. They were something more refined than that, and therefore more dangerous. "How much?" Nessa asked. Her mother told her. Nessa looked at the numbers on the table in front of her and understood, without drama, that her father had borrowed money he could never repay and had done it quietly for years while she sat in this apartment, believing the family firm was solid. "He needs you to come in," her mother said. "To the meeting. Tomorrow he says it has to be you." "Why me?" A pause. "Because you're the only one who can read the contracts." The Harrow Group's offices were on the 42nd floor of a building on Wacker Drive that looked like it had been designed to make you feel small. Nessa wore the grey blazer she saved for court appearances and carried a leather portfolio that had belonged to her grandfather. She'd told herself on the train that she was just going to read the contracts. That was all. She was good at reading contracts. She would find the exit clause, or the discrepancy, or the leverage point, because there was always one if you looked carefully enough. She had not found one by the time the elevator opened. The reception area was the kind of quiet that costs money, white stone floors. A woman at the desk who looked at Nessa the way people look at things that don't belong. Her father was already there, standing near the windows with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders doing that thing they did when he was ashamed of himself, but couldn't say so. "Nessa." He turned. He looked older than she remembered, which was strange because she'd seen him 3 weeks ago at Sunday dinner. "Dad." She didn't hug him. She looked around the room. "Where's the other party?" "He's coming. And his lawyers. He doesn't bring lawyers to these meetings." That was the first thing that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The door at the far end of the room opened, and a man walked through it, and Nessa understood immediately why he didn't need lawyers. He was tall, not in a showy way, but in a way that made the room recalibrate slightly around him. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He had a face that had seen some violence at some point, and had made its peace with that fact. There was a scar along his jaw, faint but there, and his eyes, when they found her, were the color of river water in November. Grey-green and completely unreadable. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds before he looked at her father. "You brought someone." "My daughter," her father said. "She handles the firm's contracts." I thought, I know who she is. He moved to the table at the center of the room and sat down, unhurried, like a man who had never once in his life been rushed. "Nessa Callum, you graduated top of your program at Northwestern. You've been cleaning up your father's accounting errors for the last 4 years without telling him you knew." Nessa kept her face very still. "You have my resume. I have more than your resume." He opened the folder in front of him. "My name is Harrow," she'd figured. "Sit down, Miss Callum." She sat, not because he told her to, because she needed to read what was in that folder. The debt was real. She'd already known that, but seeing the documentation made it concrete in a way that her mother's voice on the phone at 4:47 a.m. had not. Her father had borrowed against the firm 3 times over the course of 6 years, using instruments that were technically legal and practically inescapable. The interest had compounded in ways that Nessa, who understood compounding interest better than most people understood their own names, could only stare at for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "There's no exit clause," she said. "No, there's no discrepancy in the calculation. I have very good accountants." She turned a page. "The collateral listed here includes the firm's operating license, its client list, and—" She stopped. "And the family property in Michigan," Harrow said. "Yes." Her father made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She didn't look at him. "What do you want?" she asked Harrow directly. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, like he was running a calculation behind his eyes that no one else could see. "Your father can't pay. The firm has no remaining value to me as a going concern. The property in Michigan is worth acquiring, but it's not what I'm actually interested in." "Then what are you interested in?" "You?" The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Her father started to say something. Harrow didn't look at him. "Not like that," Harrow said, still watching Nessa. "I run a significant operation. Complex, multi-jurisdictional. My current financial director retired unexpectedly 6 weeks ago and left certain records in a condition that I find—" He paused. "Incomplete. You want me to fix your books. I want you to manage my accounts, legitimately and otherwise, for a period of 12 months. He set a single piece of paper on the table between them, in exchange for which your father's debt is cleared in full, the property remains in the family, and you receive a salary that I suspect will surprise you." She looked at the paper. The salary surprised her. "And after 12 months? After 12 months you leave if you want to, or you negotiate new terms." For the first time, something moved in his face. Not a smile, exactly. "Then I suggest your family enjoy the Michigan property this summer. It'll be the last summer they have it." She said yes. She told herself she said yes because of the numbers. Because the math was clear and the alternative was watching her father lose everything he'd spent his life building, even if he'd done a spectacular job of undermining it himself. She told herself that a lot in the first few weeks. The offices of Harrow's operation were not what she'd expected. She'd expected something dark and fortified, all reinforced doors and men with earpieces. Instead, she was given a corner office on the 28th floor of a building in River North, a desk that was nicer than anything she'd ever owned, and access to a server system so comprehensive and so deeply layered that she sat in front of it for 40 minutes the first morning just tracing its architecture before she even started looking at the files. The files themselves were a disaster. Not corrupt, she'd expected corrupt. She could handle corrupt. These were just wrong. Not fraudulently, but structurally. Whoever had been managing Harrow's accounts before her had clearly been a competent person operating under significant confusion, like someone who spoke the language fluently, but kept using words in the wrong order. Things were categorized incorrectly. Transactions were labeled in ways that obscured rather than clarified. Income streams were documented under the wrong entities, which meant tax exposure that someone was apparently choosing to ignore rather than address. She addressed it. She worked 11 hours the first day, 12 the second. On the third day, a cup of coffee appeared on the corner of her desk at 8 in the morning, and when she looked up, no one was there. It happened again the next day, and the next. On the 5th day, she stayed late and fell asleep at her desk, and when she woke up at 2 in the morning, there was a blanket over her shoulders, and the light above her desk had been dimmed. She looked around the empty office for a long time before she went back to work. She didn't ask about it. She met some of the people who moved through Harrow's world over those first weeks. Men and women who looked ordinary and were not, who spoke to her with careful respect that she understood was not quite directed at her personally, but at the function she served. She was the woman who managed the accounts. She was therefore to be treated with the same careful respect one extends to any person who knows where all the bodies are buried, financially speaking. She was fine with that. What she was less fine with was Harrow himself. He came to her office twice a week, always at odd hours. Once at 7 in the morning before she'd taken off her coat, once at 10 at night when she'd thought the floor was empty. He never knocked. He would sit across from her, and ask specific questions about specific line items, and she would answer them, and he would listen with his full attention in a way that she found, against her will, somewhat alarming. Most powerful men she'd worked with listened the way they read fine print, scanning for the parts that mattered to them, filtering out the rest. Harrow listened to everything. He remembered everything. He would reference something she'd said in passing 3 weeks earlier, as if she'd said it that morning. "You restructured the Meridian account," he said one evening about a month in. He was standing at her window, looking out at the city in that particular way he had of looking at things, not like he was admiring them, but like he was assessing them. "It was losing money in the way it was structured," Nessa said. "The entity classification made no sense. It was structured that way deliberately. The previous director thought the complexity provided cover. The complexity was just generating liability." She turned a page. "I eliminated it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said, which was not something she'd expected from him. "You were right to do it." She looked up. He was still looking at the window. "You don't have to tell me that," she said. "I know." He turned from the window. "I'm telling you because it's true, and because I don't say things that aren't true." She held his gaze for longer than was probably professional. "Is that an actual rule you have, or is it something you say?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Test it," he said. "You'll see." She tested it in the way she tested most things, methodically, over time, watching for inconsistencies. She found none. What she found instead was that the way Harrow operated was built on a kind of brutal precision that she recognized, structurally, from the way she thought about numbers. He said what was true. He honored what he committed to. He was not kind. He was accurate, which is a different thing and in some ways more reliable. The people who worked for him were not afraid of him the way she'd expected them to be. They were careful around him, which was different. They watched for his direction, and they followed it precisely because they had learned, presumably over time, that his direction was usually correct. She started watching for it, too. The blanket, she eventually figured out, was him. The coffee, too, probably. She didn't bring it up because she didn't know how to bring it up without sounding like she'd been cataloguing small gestures, which she had been, but only because cataloguing things was how her brain worked. Around the 2-month mark, she found the discrepancy. It wasn't in his accounts. Those were clean now, cleaner than they'd been, since probably before his previous director had started making structural errors. It was in a subsidiary account, 3 layers removed from anything she'd been explicitly asked to touch, in a notation so oblique that it would have looked like a rounding error to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. She was specifically looking for it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the file and went to find Harrow. He was in the conference room at the end of the hall, alone, with documents spread across the table in front of him and his jacket over the back of a chair. He looked up when she came in. "There's something you haven't told me about," she said. She put the printout on the table between them. He looked at it. His face did not change. "That's not part of your assignment," he said. "It's affecting the account structures I'm responsible for, which means it is. You don't want to be responsible for that. I'm already responsible for it, whether I know about it or not. That's how liability works." She kept her voice flat, professional, the way she did when she was in a meeting where she was the least powerful person in the room and needed to not look like it. "Tell me what it is, or I walk." He looked at her for a long time. She was getting better at reading the silences between his expressions. This one was the one where he was genuinely recalibrating. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He almost smiled. "Sit down, Nessa." It was the first time he'd used her name. She sat down. What he told her took about 40 minutes and was worse than what she'd imagined, in some ways, and better in others. The notation was connected to an operation he'd been running for the better part of 3 years. One that had started as a straightforward acquisition and had become something more complicated when it became clear that the previous owners of a particular set of assets had not acquired them legitimately themselves. He'd ended up in possession of evidence that he hadn't sought and didn't particularly want, and had been quietly maneuvering around for 3 years without a clean way to resolve it. "You've been protecting it," she said. "I've been managing it. It's the same thing." She looked at the printout. "There's a way to structure this so the liability sits somewhere defensible. It takes about 3 weeks and it's not simple." "Can you do it?" "That's not the right question." She looked up at him. "The right question is whether you trust me enough to let me see everything I'd need to see to do it. Because if you show me half of this and I make decisions based on half, I'll solve half the problem and create 2 new ones." He looked at her steadily. "And if I show you everything, then I'll fix it." The silence stretched. Outside the windows, the city moved in its thousands of small ways, indifferent and relentless. "Everything," he said finally. "You can see everything." The 3 weeks were the most difficult work she'd ever done. Not technically. Technically, it was the kind of puzzle she'd been training her whole career to solve. The kind that required seeing the whole shape of a system before touching any individual part of it. What made it difficult was the access. He gave her everything, the way he'd said he would, and everything turned out to be more extensive and more complicated and more human than she'd anticipated. There were names attached to things. There were histories. There were people who had made decisions in moments of desperation or ignorance or misplaced trust, and were now bound up in a structure they probably didn't fully understand, and she was in the position of deciding how to handle that. She handled it carefully. She handled it honestly. She handled it in a way that protected the people on the periphery of the situation, as much as she could while still resolving the core problem in a way that was legally defensible. When she was done, she put the documentation on his desk and sat down across from him and watched him read it. He read the whole thing, all 22 pages. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her, and she couldn't read his expression at all. "This protects 3 people who weren't your problem to protect," he said. "They were adjacent to my problem. Same thing, it costs more to structure it this way." "I know. You didn't ask me whether the cost was acceptable." "I knew it was acceptable," she said, "because I've been paying attention to how you make decisions for 8 weeks, and this is consistent with how you make decisions. I was right to do it, and you know I was right to do it." He was quiet. Something passed across his face that was too quick for her to catch. "Yes," he said, "you were." She stopped counting the weeks at some point. That was how she knew things had shifted. She couldn't point to a specific moment. It was more like the way a river gradually changes course. Small adjustments, incremental, and then one day you look up and the water is going somewhere different than it used to go. He started staying later on the evenings she worked late. Not visibly, not obviously. She would finish a section of something and go to the kitchen for water, and notice that his office light was on down the hall, even though she hadn't heard him come in. When she was dealing with a particularly complicated piece of restructuring, and had been staring at it for long enough that her eyes were crossing, she would sometimes hear, from the doorway, a question. Not about what she was working on, but adjacent to it. Something that reframed the problem slightly, and she would realize that he had been thinking about it too. She stopped being careful about what she said around him. Not careless. She was never careless, but less guarded. She told him once, without planning to, that she'd grown up watching her father make decisions based on how they looked rather than whether they were correct, and that she'd made herself a rule early on to always prioritize the math over the optics. He'd listened to that without saying anything. 3 days later, he told her something equally personal and equally unsolicited about a decision he'd made at 26 that he'd spent the subsequent years correcting, and she listened to it with the same attention he always gave her. That was what it was, she realized. Not drama, not grand gestures. It was attention. He paid attention to her with the same precision he paid attention to everything, and she found that she had started to do the same. She noticed when he skipped meals because he'd been in back-to-back meetings. She noticed when he was tired, not visibly but in the small tell of a slight delay in his responses, the way you had to know him well to catch. She noticed that he kept a photograph in the top drawer of his desk that he didn't display. and she never asked about it because she understood instinctively that it was grief, and not the kind of thing he would talk about until he chose to. She was at 9 months when she did the accounting, not the company accounts, her accounts, the internal ledger she'd been keeping unconsciously of everything that had accumulated between them. She sat at her desk late on a Tuesday evening and looked at the numbers in her head and understood that the math had already resolved itself into something she hadn't been planning for. She did what she always did when the numbers revealed something she wasn't sure she wanted to know. She looked at them again, carefully, to make sure she'd done it right. She had done it right. He came to her office on a Thursday at the 11-month mark. Not at an odd hour. In the middle of the afternoon, the middle of the workday, which was unusual enough that she looked up immediately. "There's a matter I need to discuss with you," he said. He sat across from her, and he was doing the thing he did when he was being precise about something. Hands flat on the table, posture very still, all of his attention on what he was about to say. "The 12 months are up in 30 days, he said. "I know, I want to offer you an extension of the contract." She kept her face neutral. "On what terms?" He looked at her for a moment. Different terms. Different how? He reached into his jacket and set a single piece of paper on the table between them, the same way he had done 11 months ago in this same kind of room with this same gesture, and she looked at it, and the terms were nothing like the original terms. The terms were, structurally, a proposal, not a business proposal. She understood what she was looking at immediately because she was very good at reading what things actually were underneath what they appeared to be on the surface. She sat with it. "This is not a standard contract extension," she said. "No. This changes the nature of the arrangement significantly. Yes, you understand that I've spent the last 11 months learning exactly how you think," she said. "Which means I know that this is not impulsive. You've been considering this for some time. 4 months, he said. Approximately. And you're certain. I'm certain of very few things." He looked at her steadily. "This is one of them." She looked at the piece of paper. She looked at him. She thought about the coffee that had appeared on her desk at 8 in the morning on her 4th day, and the blanket and 40 minutes of being told the truth about something he didn't have to tell her the truth about, and 22 pages of documentation that had protected 3 people she didn't have to protect, and a photograph in a drawer that was grief, and the way he listened. She had already done the accounting. She knew what the numbers said. "This would require renegotiating a number of things," she said. "I'm aware. I have conditions." Something moved through his expression, carefully, quietly, like sunlight through river water. "I assumed you would." She picked up the pen from the corner of her desk. She clicked it once, the way she always did before she started working on something that mattered. "Then let's negotiate," she said. And for the first time since she'd walked into a room on the 42nd floor of a building on Wacker Drive with her grandfather's portfolio and 11 years of other people's mistakes to correct, Nessa Callum let herself believe that the numbers might, for once, be working out in her favor.